Genesis 6-4 is not a metaphor. There are giants on the earth, antediluvian cities, and angels who descended. However, this verse has been ignored for centuries by those who fear what it truly implies if taken literally. Because God himself ordered that no physical trace of what that civilization achieved before the flood would remain. And yet, the texts survived, and what they describe challenges everything that official history has taught. Did advanced cities exist before the flood? Cities that God himself decided to erase from history. What you will hear does not come from modern theories, but from ancient manuscripts that few have dared to read. The Book of Enoch, the fragments of the Book of Jasher, and the writings of Josephus all agree on one disturbing point. Before the first drop of the universal flood fell, there were 7 cities with a terrifying level of technology. They were not simple cities. They were centers of power built with knowledge that humans should not have possessed. The account of its destruction is not just a religious story, it is a pattern that repeats itself today before our eyes. But to understand why God erased them, you must first comprehend who built them and for what exact purpose. Genesis 4:17 records a fact that most readers overlook without pausing to consider its true significance. Cain, marked by God and expelled to the east of Eden, did not become a wandering nomad, as many suppose. Instead, he founded the first city recorded in the Bible and named it Enoch, in honor of his firstborn son. This act was not casual. It was a declaration of intentions in the face of the divine judgment weighing upon his lineage. Building a city meant creating its own order, an alternative system to the one God established in Eden. Flavius Josephus, a first-century Jewish historian, describes this city as a structure with massive walls. The question that no manual answers is this: why did such an early city need such large walls? Cain knew that a judgment would come and was building something designed to challenge it, to survive even God himself. The texts of the Book of Jubilees, chapter 4, reveal that writing and agriculture emerged in Enoch. But the texts also reveal something disturbing that traditional theology preferred to keep out of public debate. The descendants of Cain began in that city the first experiments with the mixing of animal species. First there were animals, but the texts suggest that the experimentation advanced towards something we have not yet named. The pattern was clear from the beginning. Enoch was not built to worship the Creator, but to replace him. While this was happening on earth, the Book of Enoch, chapter 6, records an event that would change everything. 200 beings called the Watchers descended from the sky and chose a precise point of descent on earth. They did not choose a random place. They descended upon Mount Hermon in the north of what is today Syria and Israel. They established pacts with the leaders of 7 cities, agreements that went far beyond the merely spiritual. These were not peace treaties. They were direct transfers of forbidden knowledge delivered city by city. The Watchers taught advanced metallurgy, precision astronomy, materials engineering, and genetic arts. They did it systematically, as if each city had a role within a perfectly laid out plan. The second city, Irad, mentioned in Genesis 4:18, was not just the name of a descendant in the line of Cain. The analysis of the original Hebrew reveals that Irad also designated a place, an urban center for mineral extraction. The fragments of the Book of Jasher, chapter 2, describe it as the mining city of the entire antediluvian world. Gold, silver, and rare metals were extracted there, not for trade, but for a purpose that sends shivers down the spine to read about. Statues made of precious materials were erected in every square and every significant building of the city. In Irad, there were blacksmiths who tirelessly melted metals for statues that no one on earth should have worshipped. The heat from the furnaces was constant. The noise of the anvil never ceased, and the smoke from the molten metal permeated everything. Irad did not produce wealth for its inhabitants. It produced devotion towards entities that demanded every gram as an offering. The third city, Meujael, whose name can be translated as the city of those erased by God, is unsettling. Why would it carry that name before the flood that was supposedly going to wipe them out, unless it was a warning? Meujael was the academy of the Antediluvian world, but not in the divine sense one imagines upon hearing that name. It was the center of astrologers and sorcerers who studied the heavens not to worship the Creator, but to control him. Their astronomical records spanned cycles of thousands of years with a precision that no later civilization would match. And they used that knowledge not to understand God's creation, but to predict and manipulate the fate of men. Irad and Meujael operated in perfect coordination, like the gears of the same machine with a single objective. The first produced the physical resources, the second generated the dark knowledge necessary to use them. Together, they tried to build something that required both material and spiritual power, in amounts never seen before. The texts suggest that they wanted to create a structure capable of attracting more watchers from the heavens to the earth. And they succeeded, for it was after the founding of these cities that the 200 angels descended to Hermon. The first 3 cities were not accidents. They were infrastructure designed to receive the fallen angels. Enoch was the political capital, Irad the resource center, and Meujael the academy of the dark knowledge of the system. It was an inverted trinity, a deliberate imitation of the divine structure turned into a tool of total rebellion. But these 3 cities were just the preparation for what would come after the Watchers arrived in the world. After the pact on Mount Hermon, the construction of 4 new cities completely transformed the scale of evil. The 4th city, Metusael, which ironically means man of God, was the epicenter of the greatest abomination. Genesis 6-4 records it with a clarity that is unsettling. The Nephilim were on the earth in those specific days. The Book of Enoch chapter 7 describes these creatures with a precision that is difficult to process today. The Nephilim were not simply large. Their mere presence altered the behavior of the human beings around them. Born of the Watchers and human women, the Nephilim grew by violating all known natural laws. The texts mention heights that exceeded 3,000 cubits, a measure equivalent to more than 400 meters. Although it sounds impossible, the findings of the 19th century in Nevada, Ohio, and the Middle East give much to think about. Skeletons ranging from 3 to 5 meters were discovered and catalogued before disappearing without an official explanation. Metusael was designed to house them, with doors over 22 meters high, according to ancient texts. The buildings were monumental stone structures that required construction techniques still not understood. The Book of Enoch describes its behavior with words that create a discomfort that is very difficult to ignore. The Nephilim consumed all the work of men until they could no longer support them with their production. Then they turned against humans and began to devour not only animals, but also the people themselves. Metusael was not a normal city in any sense. It was a control zone where the Nephilim dominated everything. The texts describe his voice as thunder, his step shaking the ground, and no man could look at them directly. The nearby cities sent periodic tributes of food to appease the insatiable demand of the giants. It was a system of terror, accepted as the norm by a humanity that had completely forgotten its creator. The fifth city, Lamech, represents the institutionalization of violence as a social norm and legal system. Genesis 4:23 records his own words with a coldness that no other biblical text matches in Scripture. He killed a young man for wounding him and sang an ode to the deed, declaring that his revenge would be 70 times that of Cain. In Lamech, laws were codified that protected the right to eliminate the weakest without consequence or punishment. It was the city where violence ceased to be a crime and became a public virtue celebrated by all. The apocryphal texts describe arenas where the Nephilim destroyed before crowds that applauded with great enthusiasm. Common citizens competed for the honor of serving as servants to these creatures of impossible proportions. Lamech was also the first statesman to justify violence with philosophical language, framing it as a social virtue. Power in Lamech was not inherited by lineage. It was earned through demonstrated ability to destroy competitors without hesitation. It was a city that had completely inverted divine law. The strongest did not protect the weak, but eliminated them with pride. The sixth city was named Jubal and specialized in something that is profoundly unsettling when reading about its function. It was the breeding center of the Antediluvian world, but not for conventional livestock, as it might superficially seem. The Hebrew text uses a specific word that encompasses the intentional mixing of distinct species in the same process. The Watchers had taught in that city the art of combining genetic traits from different animals among themselves. Creatures were produced that did not exist in the original nature, the same ones that later Greeks would call chimeras. But the mix was not limited to the animal kingdom. Dark fragments from the Book of Enoch suggest something much more serious. Attempts were made to combine traits of the Nephilim with animals, and experiments on humans also progressed. Jubal's experiments did not seek to understand nature. They aimed to rewrite it according to the principles of the Watchers. The creatures produced there had no place in God's original creation. They were deliberate mistakes of enormous magnitude. Some experiments survived in the collective memory, transformed into the mythical beasts of later civilizations. The seventh city was Tubal-Cain, the great technological arsenal of the world that existed before the universal flood. Genesis 4:22 mentions him as a craftsman of bronze and iron tools in a time when that was impossible. The metallurgy of iron should not have existed then, according to all known conventional historical chronology. However, the texts confirm that Tubal-Cain mastered not only bronze, but also alloys that are unknown today. The later Masonic tradition venerated this figure as the secret origin of its initiatory technical knowledge. The weapons of Tubal-Cain were not just tools of war, they were instruments of domination to enslave entire peoples. The knowledge transmitted there compressed centuries of natural technological development into a single human generation. Tubal-Cain exported that knowledge to the other 6 cities, completing the network of dependency that the Watchers had created. It was the final link in a system with political capital, resources, dark knowledge, giants, and elite weaponry. The 7 cities operated as a coordinated network under the direction of the Watchers and their descendants on Earth. They had exchanges among themselves, sharing dark knowledge and a common vision of a world built without the Creator. Genesis 6-5 summarizes the outcome with words that leave no room for interpretation or any possible ambiguity. God saw that the wickedness of man was great, and that every intent of his heart was only evil continually. This does not describe a vicious society. It describes a civilization that completely redesigned its cognitive structure. Evil was not an exception in those cities. It was the organizing principle of every institution and every existing norm. The 7 cities together represented what God had prevented in Eden, an autonomous human order without the Creator. Each city fulfilled its function with an efficiency possible only when evil operates without any prevailing moral obstacles. And the final result of that system converged in a humanity that had eradicated the image of the Creator from itself. And here arises the question that many readers have never asked themselves with the seriousness it truly deserves. If these cities were so advanced, if they had science and architecture and engineering, why is there no trace? The answer is not in the absence of evidence, but in the specific nature of the flood that we underestimate so much. The water that fell was not ordinary rain. Genesis 7:11 describes the breaking of the fountains of the great underground abyss. This means that the water not only came from the sky, but also emerged from deep within the earth under enormous pressure. Geologists confirmed that there is water equivalent to 3 oceans trapped in the deepest part of the Earth's mantle. If those reserves were released simultaneously, the pressure would have pulverized any structure on the surface. The waters not only destroyed, but also sedimented and transformed the entire geological landscape in just a few weeks. The cities are not beneath the current oceans. They are buried under kilometers of sediment and compressed rock. Fossil record scientists describe mass extinctions and abrupt geological changes that align with that event. The presence of marine fossils on mountaintops around the world is not an anomaly. It is the physical evidence of Genesis. The world we know survived the flood. It is not the world that existed before, and the difference between the two is vast. But there is another reason why God erased these cities with a completeness that goes beyond physical destruction. God knew what post-Diluvian humanity would inevitably do if they found the intact ruins of those cities. I would study them, reconstruct them, adore them, and repeat exactly the same process that led them to destroy themselves. The evidence is in what happened just 2 generations after the flood in the plain of Shinar in Babylon. With only the knowledge passed down through Cam, Noah's son, humanity attempted to build a great tower. Babel was the attempt to reconstruct with second-hand information what the 7 cities achieved with assistance. Imagine what they would have tried if they had direct access to the artifacts of those intact cities. Total erasure was not arbitrary destruction. It was the most radical act of love a parent can have for their children. Preserving the image of God in humanity required eliminating the model that proved living in rebellion was possible. But the texts add something that popular theology rarely mentions, even though it is clearly written in the scriptures. Although the cities disappeared, the knowledge they generated was not completely destroyed, but sealed and hidden. The spirits of the dead Nephilim, whom the Book of Enoch calls demons of the earth, retained that knowledge. Revelation 12:12 warns that in the last days that spirit will descend with fury, knowing that it has little time left. This explains why those spirits do not need to reinvent the system. They just need humanity to rebuild it. Every advance presented as neutral progress is a step towards the reconstruction of what water destroyed millennia ago. Daniel describes 4 world empires and a 5th that crushes them. But before the 5th, the Antediluvian pattern returns. Not as coincidence or natural evolution, but as the repetition of a program that has been waiting to be executed for millennia. What we see today is not spontaneous progress. It is the acceleration of a pattern that has already occurred exactly once before. In 2018, He Jiankui genetically edited 2 living human babies by permanently altering their germline. In 2023, the FDA approved the first gene-editing therapies in humans using the same technology that everyone is discussing. Laboratories today create chimeras, animal-human hybrids, and they call them that, chimeras, with the same ancient name. The Neuralink project implanted brain chips in humans with the stated goal of enhancing cognition. Scientists are openly working on life extension technologies aimed at eliminating human aging. Klaus Schwab publicly declared that technology will change what it means to be human over the course of this century. Yuval Harari, his advisor, stated in globally influential books that humans are hackable and redesignable animals. This is not the language of neutral progress. It is the language of transhumanism that replicates the vision of the Watchers. The Watchers also promised to improve humanity. They also said that knowledge would elevate the entire species. And the result was what the Book of Enoch documents: the destruction of the divine image in all of humankind. Matthew 24:37 records the exact words that Jesus used to describe the time preceding his return to earth. He said it would be like in the days of Noah, and he did not use that comparison poetically, but in a technical and precise manner. The genetic corruption that we now call gene editing and transhumanism reflects exactly that same ancient pattern. The systemic violence visible in human trafficking, ongoing conflicts, and dehumanization echoes that era. The blend of the human with the non-human, the digital biological fusion, was exactly what the Watchers introduced. Current cities are built without any reference to the Creator, just like the 7 antediluvian cities. And the most terrifying parallel is a generation that hears the warnings and continues to live as if it had not heard them. The Davos Forum brings together the architects of the global system, and their statements no longer hide their true intentions. The agenda of digital identity, centralized currency, and climate control is not security. It is total, absolute control. As the 7 cities operated under the Watchers, global institutions converge today under a single unique vision. The speed of implementation exceeds human capacity to assess consequences before they become irreversible. The Watchers accelerated knowledge so that corruption would reach critical mass just before the divine judgment. Today, that acceleration is measurable. AI models double their capacity every few months without anyone having given their permission. The spirit of Meujael, which calculated to control destiny, operates today in the algorithms that govern all information. The spirit of Tubal-Cain, who forged unprecedented weapons, operates today in the advanced weaponry laboratories of the world. Genesis 6:3 records that God granted 120 years of warning before the universal flood began. During that time, Noah built the ark in public, preached with his life and his words, and absolutely no one listened to him. 2 Peter 2-5 calls him a herald of justice, a term that implies formal proclamation before rebellious audiences. No one believed until the doors of the ark closed and the water began to fall with irreversible force upon everyone. Since Israel became a nation again in 1948, exactly 77 years have passed, which is a complete biblical generation. Psalm 90:10 defines a biblical generation as 70 years or up to 80, and we are exactly at that threshold. The signs that the prophetic texts described for the last days are not coming. They arrived a long time ago. You are not hearing this by chance. The patterns of ancient texts converge at this exact present moment. Noah was an ordinary man who chose to obey when no one else in the known world was willing to do the same. And that ordinary obedience in extreme circumstances is what the texts present as the only true way out. The 7 cities had technology, knowledge, and power, but none had what Noah possessed from the very beginning of everything. I had an unbroken relationship with the Creator, the only variable that determined who survived and who disappeared forever. The difference between the inhabitants of the 7 antediluvian cities and the people who live today is just one thing. The inhabitants of Enoch, Irad, Meujael, Metusael, Lamech, Jabal, and Tubal-Cain did not know that judgment would come upon them. We do know it because it is written, prophesied, and documented with a coherence that defies coincidence. The 7 cities disappeared beneath the waters without a trace, only God's judgment as an eternal testimony of their error. They did not build the ark, they did not listen to the herald, they did not see the pattern until the water reached their own doors. That choice is no longer available in the same way, because today you have the knowledge that they never possessed. The reason God destroyed those 7 cities was not out of hatred or whim, but rather the most radical love that exists. It was the act of stopping a system that consumed humanity to preserve the possibility of future redemption. That same love is active today in every warning, in every sign, in every text that reaches your eyes in time. The question that remains is neither historical nor academic. It is completely personal and does not allow for any deferred response. Are you recognizing the pattern, or are you living as if the water isn't going to come, just like they did before? The story of the 7 cities is not a theological curiosity. It is the exact map of the territory we traverse today. Every piece of the pattern is in its place. Forbidden knowledge, genetic corruption, systemic violence, cities without God. Only one thing is missing to complete the parallel, and the prophetic texts indicate that it is closer than anyone imagines. Noah built the ark while the world laughed, and when they stopped laughing, it was already too late to board with him. You are reading this before it starts to rain, and that is exactly the difference between Noah and everyone else. If you want to continue uncovering the mysteries that biblical and apocryphal texts hold, subscribe and activate alerts.